Welcome to Center for Strengthening Relationships. I'm Joel.
And I'm Tarina. We're licensed professional counselors and relationship experts. Here we share the therapeutic tools and insights to help you strengthen the relationships in your life.
Today we're continuing our series on boundaries and focusing today on boundaries with your family.
Right, and the word family brings up different things for different people. For example, there's the nuclear family, extended family. There's, in the LGBT community, which I work with quite a bit, the idea of found family or chosen family. For today's video, though, we are going to focus on the family of origin.
So family of origin refers to the family in which you were raised. It can be the nuclear family, your biological parents or adoptive parents or siblings, but it also refers to individuals that were part of your household or your common relationship environment growing up. They can be, if you're part of a multi-generational household, also include aunts, uncles, or grandparents. Or if you had cousins that your family is very close to that lived across the street, or your neighbor, and they were over all the time, or you were over at their house all the time, that would also be considered your family in terms of family of origin. It's not related to just the direct family you were born into, but those who were a significant influence in your childhood growing up and a consistent presence in your life.
Right, so they're the people who really shape who we are, our values, our understanding of family, relationships, boundaries.
Yeah. They're where we learned what love and affection look like, how to communicate, how to resolve conflict when there is a fight or a problem that comes up. Those are all the things that we learn from our family of origin, and they're very important because we then end up emulating those patterns and those behaviors throughout our life, often very much unconsciously without being aware of it. Mm-hmm. And one piece I love sharing with clients is kind of challenging assumptions and phrases we've heard over and over. Most of us have heard the phrase blood is thicker than water, and we take that to mean that our family relationships are the absolute most important and strongest relationships and are always to be fought for and never given up upon. But what the full phrase is actually the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. What it really means is the relationships you choose are more valuable and can be more important than those that you're born into. And so I share that with you because sometimes that can have a really profound impact on how we interpret that meaning and cause us to relook at some choices we've made based on that assumption.
So in the last video, which was our introduction to boundaries, we defined what boundaries were. And just as a little refresher, they can be physical, mental, and emotional. And basically, it's the space that we need around us to feel safe and protect our well-being, and thereby allow us to engage in healthy relationships. And the amount of space needed by each individual is unique.
And I'd also like to add that the boundaries we're going to talk about today with family of origin are based on an American-centric culture, because there are many cultures where boundaries look very different, and that's very much celebrated or desired within the family environment. So just keep in mind that what we're talking about today is from the individualistic culture of American norms.
So some of the common struggles we experience when we are faced with setting boundaries with our families is that we often feel responsible for the feelings of others, especially those that we care about. So it can be really hard to keep that emotional separation, which we talked about in the last video, which we'll link right here, with the Personal Bill of Rights. So some families use very overt measures that they use to manipulate others into relaxing those personal boundaries that they need. Sometimes this comes in the form of guilt tripping, and some families feel very emotionally enmeshed.
So enmeshment is a term used in family systems theory and psychology to describe a situation where personal boundaries between family members are overly blurred or intertwined. In an enmeshed family, members may become overly involved in each other's lives to the extent that they lose their own sense of individuality and personal autonomy.
Right, so how do you know if your family is enmeshed? Well, there are 5 key characteristics of enmeshed families. The first one is lack of boundaries. Families may over-identify with one another's feelings, actions, and behaviors, and this can lead to feelings of suffocation, guilt, anxiety, confusion. because individuals may feel trapped by the expectations and emotional demands of their family.
Number 2 is over-involvement. Enmeshed families may be overly involved in each other's lives. This might mean excessive sharing, or making decisions for one another, or becoming involved in conflicts with another person that don't necessarily involve that individual. This type of enmeshment can be particularly harmful for a child if the parent over-relies on that child. A common example is if the parent doesn't have their own social support network in which to confide in their problems or receive support, so they end up using one of their children. At first, this child might feel special by this because their mommy or daddy's little helper and they get special alone time with the parents. But what often happens then is because of that blurred boundary, that child then has significant difficulties in relationships later in life because of those blurred boundaries that weren't very clear of what that respect and autonomy should look like.
The third type of enmeshment in families is dependence. Enmeshment can lead to excessive dependence upon family members, in which case it can often be difficult for the individual to be able to make decisions on their own. And they feel that they always need to run things by a family member. An example of how this can really become detrimental when people become adults is someone gets married and their partner is thinking, oh, we're creating our family unit. We are making decisions together as a team, and they have a partner who is constantly checking in with their parents and family members, and they may put their family members' opinions and beliefs above that of their partners.
So number 4 is control. And enmeshment can also look like control when a family member attempts to control the thoughts, behaviors, or feelings of another member of that family, or attempts to fix that person's problems for them. This type of enmeshment is most often represented in abusive relationships, where one party might try to separate the other from their relationships outside of that relationship itself, distancing them from other social supports, so they have to then rely more and more on the individual who's doing the controlling. Individuals that have been present in this type of relationship may have trouble identifying their own sense of self because they're very accustomed to over-identifying with the needs, behaviors, or feelings of someone else in the relationship.
And number 5 is emotional reactivity. So high levels of emotional reactivity are pretty common in enmeshed families because personal boundaries are unclear. And so individuals may begin to take on the emotion of others, which can lead to pretty intense emotional reactions and conflict. An example of this could be a situation where an adult daughter comes to her mom and she's excited because she has received a job offer in another state. And her mom becomes very emotional about this and begins to cry and say, "How could you leave me? You're abandoning me." And the daughter takes on this emotion as her own, and she feels a lot of guilt and conflict, and oftentimes will give up on her dream in order to appease the family member and maintain the family's equilibrium.
If you grew up in these types of environments, you may have a hard time even recognizing what boundaries are. It might seem like a foreign or alien concept to you. So how do you know if you might need to think about implementing some more boundaries in your life? If you leave family interactions feeling very drained, or you have a hard time saying no to other people and putting their needs ahead of yours, or if you identify as a people pleaser, those are 3 common factors that might tell you need to take just a little bit more of a look at your own boundaries in your life. So now that you recognize the type of family enmeshment that you grew up in, you may be asking yourself, well, how do I begin to establish boundaries? So 3 steps to start are 1, clearly communicating what your needs and boundaries are, practicing saying no, and establishing consequences if the boundaries aren't followed through with.
That sounds pretty easy, huh? Just 1, 2, 3. Boundaries are done. So here's the reality of it. It is much easier said than done. It would be really nice if we all grew up in a family where we knew how to communicate clearly and say no and set consequences if boundaries are crossed. But given that you have likely just identified with coming from a very enmeshed family with lack of clear boundaries, chances are that was not modeled for you. So this is where working with a skilled therapist can come in really handy in learning how to really enact these 3 simple steps.
And that could include modeling the conversation, because you may recognize, like, how in the world do I even start this conversation? Or how do I deal with the guilt or the pressure that I anticipate having from setting this boundary? Because that can be a big factor in terms of not having consistency. So therapy can really help receive support and work through some of those concerns so you can begin implementing healthier boundaries in your life.
Right. So in therapy, you have an opportunity to gain new insights. You can learn what a healthy relationship looks like. And as Joel mentioned, something I often do with my clients is role play. The communication wheel is something that I teach pretty early on. We have a video teaching this, and we'll role play a situation with a family member. And we'll work on how they can explain, hey, this is how I'm feeling in this situation. This is what I'm needing. This is what I'm wanting. Going through those pieces and making it really clear that this is okay with me. This isn't okay with me. And if these things happen, this is what I'll be doing to protect myself. Not because I don't love you, but in order to protect my well-being, because I do value our relationship. I don't want to grow resentful. So another thing we'll do is we prepare for resistance, because often clients will say, well, this is what my parent will say, or this is what my sibling, whomever it is, this is how they're going to respond. So we'll practice how to handle that type of resistance.
Now, when we set boundaries, it may feel like an ultimatum, but they're very distinct different things. And here's why. When you set a boundary, that's based on your own needs that you've thought through in terms of, this is what I need for my physical, emotional, or mental well-being. And these are the rules I'm going to stick to for myself to protect those areas of my life. And then when you set a boundary, you tell someone, I need these things in order to feel safe and be mentally well. And if one of those things is violated, I will have to take an action to preserve those values that I've promised to myself. When you give an ultimatum, that's more of a threat directed at the other person about controlling a decision or behavior they do. You may or may not like the decision they're making, hence the threat, but that's more about controlling them versus honoring some values that you've already pre-described for yourself.
Right, yeah, because often a client will say to me, it feels like I'm giving this person an ultimatum. And so we often have a discussion about exactly this, that a boundary is just saying, hey, this is okay with me, this isn't. If this happens, I am going to, whatever it is that you've decided ahead of time. It's not an in-the-moment reactive decision. It's a proactive response of, if this happens, I'm going to end this conversation. I am going to take a breather. Sometimes it's, I'm going to leave this relationship. And the important thing to realize is that's a fair boundary. You're not trying to coerce or manipulate as an ultimatum often does. An ultimatum is, how can I get this person to do what I want? If you don't do this, I'm going to do this. And you may have no intention of following through on it, but you're kind of desperate and you're emotionally reactive perhaps in that moment, and this is your attempt to get the end results that you need.
Yes. And the concise version of this would be to think about boundaries are focused on myself and what I'm comfortable with for me, and they apply almost universally in the world, where manipulation is focused on external people outside of ourselves. Yeah, so if that was too long, just focus on me as a boundary, other people, manipulation.
Yes. So the next aspect of boundaries is, how do we maintain them? And this is really important to remain consistent, because one of the challenges that often pops up with the adults I work with who were parentified children, meaning they were that child that their parent, often an adult family member, confided in, and they felt really special. And as an adult, they realize, wow, I didn't have that typical family relationship where I felt that they were looking out for me. I was always really looking out for them. And when I was little, it made me feel really special. Like I was a good little helper. And so you become an adult and you're like, ew, this feels really enmeshed. I'm going to set a boundary. I don't want my parents calling me every time they're upset or every time they're fighting with one another. So they set a boundary, but they find themselves being pulled back into it. Because whereas one part wants that boundary and sees that it's really important, there's another part of them that has really identified with that role of family therapist. And it feels good. It feels special to be able to help the people that you care about. So it's really important to maintain consistency with those boundaries. Although again, often easier said than done. And this is something we find ourselves revisiting often in sessions in the beginning as people are learning how to identify when a boundary has been crossed and resetting those boundaries over and over again. And it is especially difficult with parents because a little phrase that I learned from Joel that I often share with my clients is...
Our families know how to push our buttons because they're the ones who installed them.
Yes. Yeah, my clients usually get a pretty good kick out of that, like I did when you first said it to me. It's a lot of truth in that. But also know that those boundaries we set, so as much as it's important to stay consistent, they can evolve over time. An example would be two siblings. And one is in therapy and doing their work and saying, hey, I've been the family therapist for a long time. I can't take this role anymore. And they set a boundary with their sibling who is constantly coming to them, complaining about mom and dad or other relationships. So they say, hey, I can't be the family therapist. Maybe you want to talk to a friend about this, or better yet, get your own therapist and kind of process this. And their sibling begins to do that work. At that point, the boundary might change a little bit because the sibling is no longer using their brother or sister as their therapist, but rather they're able to talk to one another about the things that they're both processing. And that sibling relationship, when it's a healthy adult relationship like this and each are doing their own work, can be a really big part of the healing journey because it really helps to validate some of those childhood experiences where you start to question yourself. Did that really happen? It didn't feel right to me. And then you bounce it off your sibling and they're like, that happened. Yep, that's the family we grew up in. And it can become, like I said, part of the healing.
Yeah, and a great way to think about that is when systems change in your family environment, that can be a good time to reevaluate if you need to make any changes to your boundaries. You may not, but that is a great example of a sibling making changes. That system dynamic with your sibling may change, so that allows you to then re-examine those boundaries and make any adjustments as needed. The most difficult part of setting boundaries is usually the emotional aspect because sometimes guilt comes up. And that's a very natural response because if you think back to the early days of human civilization, when we were very small tribes in very small towns, you needed that support structure in order to survive. If you were cast out of that tribe, that is a very high likelihood that meant death for you. So that is kind of baked into our DNA of needing acceptance and inclusion in your tribe that you're brought up in. So fear is a very natural part of this whole process because again, if you're rejected by your tribe, that means death for someone. And that is thankfully no longer the case. And so working with a therapist and ways we've described can really help you move through those parts.
Right, and this would be a good place to check out the If I Lose My Pen, I Will Die video that I made a few years ago, because it is kind of that our brain immediately goes to death. I've set a boundary and that means death. And again, as Joel was saying, that's really worked into our DNA. Fitting in and belonging is how our DNA has been able to survive through the millennia that we're here today. It's a normal part, it's a natural part of being human, but finding how to keep that in check when it becomes so extreme and we leap to, I set a boundary, I'm afraid I'm going to be outcast and die. We might not be consciously aware that that's where our mind's going. We're wondering why we're having such a strong visceral reaction. But if we kind of break that down, we often find that at the foundation of it all is a fear of death. So check out that video.
So a similar part of that is guilt may also be playing a role because if you recognize you were a people pleaser in your enmeshed family environment, causing anyone some form of emotional harm might feel really foreign to you, and it might be really painful. So again, really natural reactions that come up.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I actually just had a session this week talking about this. There can be the fear for ourselves and our own well-being, but also that fear for a loved one and that guilt. I'm not here for them. In this situation, it was fear that if I'm not there for this family member, they might kill themselves, and that would be on me. And how would I recover from that? So it was death of a loved one. So practicing self-compassion by deepening our relationship with ourselves is one way of protecting our boundaries and working with that fear-driven emotional aspect that arises. So another method I use with my clients is related to cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is where we identify, where did this internalized message come from? And if it's not from what we call the capital S self, which is our true essence of who we are before all of the big T and little t traumas of life, tapping into our true self, getting to know that part of ourself, and identifying, is this message a message that is true and authentic to me, or did it come from someone or somewhere outside of me, whether that's family or societal messaging? And when you identify where that message came from, if it's from outside of yourself, we'll look and start to examine the evidence, where we're determining, is this a source that I respect? Is this someone that I want to emulate? Is this a societal norm that fits with my own internal values? And from there, we decide what are the boundaries that are right for us.
So given that our practice is called the Center for Strengthening Relationships, you may be wondering how boundaries fits into that. Because after all, for some of us who have always been people pleasers, having a boundary might feel kind of mean, especially if you have the inner belief that we should always be kind to other people, give the shirt off our back. It might feel like we're really withholding support or causing harm to another individual. But what it really means is putting on your oxygen mask first. If you ever think about anytime you've ridden on an airline and the flight attendants are talking about emergency procedures, and if you have a child with you, they'll say, take your oxygen mask, put it on yourself first, and then help someone with you. The whole purpose is the same. If you're not taking care of your own needs, then you're not able to long-term have a healthy relationship with someone else, be there for them in support, and be there to nurture the relationship along. If you don't have a healthy boundary and all you do is give and give and give, and you have someone in your life who does nothing but take, eventually resentment may creep into that relationship, and you might find yourself bitter or burnt out. So in reality, healthy boundaries actually make sure that there's known expectations of relationships, and it really fosters longer term, healthier, stronger relationships with people in your life.
And if you need more support in setting these boundaries, it might help to know that this is actually supported by some peer-reviewed research that we found. In the research titled Intergenerational Family Boundaries and Adult Children's Marital Satisfaction, what they explored was how family boundaries impact adult children's marital satisfaction. It highlighted the importance of clear boundaries within the family of origin to support healthier romantic relationships later in life. What this research found was that the stronger, more defined the boundaries are within the family of origin can lead to greater adaptability and cohesion in adult romantic relationships, which then in turn enhances marital satisfaction. It also found that families with unclear or enmeshed boundaries often experience higher levels of stress and conflict, making boundary setting in the family of origin a crucial aspect of maintaining healthy adult relationships. Then there was a series of studies based on the Bowen Family Systems Theory, which examined the role of family of origin dynamics on adults' physical and psychological well-being. So what this research emphasized was that unresolved issues or unclear boundaries within the family of origin can lead to more emotional reactivity, fusion with others, or emotional cutoff, which are detrimental to an individual's well-being. This underscores the necessity of establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries within one's family of origin, in order to promote personal autonomy and reduce anxiety in relationships.
And this is a good place to return to something I'd mentioned earlier, and that is a lot of this conversation we're happening today is around the individualistic cultural norms of American culture, where sometimes individuation from one's family is a celebrated or sometimes necessary step for moving on into adulthood. So recognizing that, if you come from a culture that is more collectivistic in nature, some of these concepts may not resonate with you or may really clash against what your family norms and family values are. And that's absolutely okay. This is not a one size fits all, but more of a focusing on American standards and also recognizing that sometimes boundaries can be necessary no matter the culture you're from. You may recognize that you're still in a toxic or abusive relationship and want to give yourself a little more personal space.
Right, and I actually find this comes up quite often with clients that I have that are second generation Americans. When they come from a family background where the culture is very multi-generational household, a very collectivistic unit, which has a lot of wonderful things about it, but sometimes it's hard when they grow up here and they see their friends moving out and getting jobs and having their own financial independence, and there are expectations within the family that you either stay living at home or you're contributing financially in some way. And depending on the situation, sometimes that is the right thing for that individual. It's something that they're choosing to continue to do. In other situations, especially if there are any of those 5 traits we went through earlier of when boundaries can be enmeshed and really unhealthy for someone, in those cases, the individuals that I work with are really trying to figure out, how do I set a boundary that's healthy for me but doesn't lead to extreme guilt? Another aspect about this that I talk with my clients about, which I think is pretty cool, is that as adults, if we are consciously creating our life rather than just kind of falling into the old patterns that we were raised with, when we come together with our partner, we can have conversations about, what was your family of origin like? This is, I've mentioned the John Gottman book before. There are a lot of exercises in here where he guides you through these conversations where you can talk about things like, how did your family express negative emotions growing up? Like fear or anger? How did they celebrate? How did they celebrate one another's accomplishments? And we can decide, hey, I really liked these aspects of my family growing up and I'd like to incorporate them into our family culture. Or these aspects didn't feel so healthy and I'd really like to make a conscious decision to do things differently. So when you come together and have these conversations, you get to decide, what is our family culture going to be like? And another thing that I always really impress upon my clients is that is for you and your partner to decide. It's not for me as the therapist to say, well, this is the way that Joel and I do it, so this is the way you should do it. Nor is it the way your families can dictate to you. This is something that you get to decide for yourselves. And it really creates a very special and unique bond to know that we've created this family culture. So I think that's about it for talking about family boundaries today.
Yep.
But if there's something we missed and you want to ask a question that you would like us to address, or if you want to share your own experiences with setting boundaries within your family of origin, please leave it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you for joining us today. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing.
We really appreciate your time, and we hope that what we're talking about today helps you build happier, healthier, stronger relationships.
Thank you for being a part of our community. Let's do this together.